We are in Trinity College, Dublin, where we have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Konstantin Gurdjieff, who is a lecturer on finance in the Department of Business. Konstantin, one particular item which has never been touched on in the discussions and the debates about what has happened to Ireland, to the economy of Ireland, is the rent control, to be precise. Because where I'm coming from is Italy. The experience we had in Italy during our boom in the early 70s, one thing that the government did was to freeze rent. In fact, they introduced the so-called equo canone, which is equitable rent. Now, this has never been talked about because, in my opinion, and the opinion of many observers, had rent control been introduced during the Celtic Tiger, we would not have had the unbridled speculation, property speculation, which was one of the major factors which brought Irish economy down to its knees. What is your take on that?
Well, in the short run, rent controls and price fixes in general would help alleviate kind of the, if you want, the pressure on the speculative side, as you mentioned that. In the long run, however, I think they actually have the opposite effect. If you look at the likes of the United States, where the rent controls have been instituted, the likes of, for example, Santa Monica, San Francisco, New York, it had resulted over the long run in even bigger bubbles. So the problem there is that we think of the rent control as the Tobin-style tax or the Tobin-style mechanism which prevents the high frequency of transactions. It reduces the volume of turnover in the rental market, and as a result of it creates security of tenure and things like that, which is a positive thing in the short run. In the long run, if you have the speculative development in the economy, that speculative development will actually become even more pronounced. There is a paper in 2002-2003 published by a group of researchers from Princeton University, which shows in the theoretical setting very clearly that the transaction type of tax or restriction on transactions in general in certain asset markets works very much beneficial to reduce the pressures of the bubble formation. That applies to the markets where there is a very high frequency of exchanges, such as the foreign exchange, for example, or the stock markets. However, in the markets for assets which are what we call sticky, in other words, they're not traded all of the time, such as property or rents, for example, it has exactly the opposite effect. In the short run, it reduces the pressures, but in the long run, it actually creates a longer build-up in the bubble phase. And as a result of that, bubbles become more pronounced. And it also reduces the ability to sell and get out from the market right before the bubble bursts, and after as well. So as a result of it, the bubbles become bigger and longer as well. It's pretty much what's borne out by evidence. So rent control as such is probably not so much of an issue. The more of an issue is the security of tenure. And the security of tenure, the laws which govern the rental agreements, for example, between the tenants and the landlords, is something that had a very adverse effect, or lack of that security of tenure, very adverse effect on the property markets here in, say, 2003 through 2007, during the bubble. Because if you go back to that period, what was very clear is that owning a house, using the mortgage to pay for the housing benefits, was cheaper than having a rent. And at the same time, the quality of properties which were available for rent was extremely low. So if you take hedonic model and you think in terms of the relationship between the rent and the price on a basis of capital appreciation and then the stream of benefits that you are getting from either renting or living in the home that you are financing through the mortgage, if you take out the capital appreciation side, which is the speculative side of it, yes, and you just focus on the side of the benefits, you were actually better off. You were getting better property, and you were getting it cheaper if you were to buy through mortgage. That distortion wasn't really due to the rent controls, and I don't think in the long run rent controls would have solved the problem. It was more of an issue of two things, two forces, which simultaneously also helped to fuel capital appreciation side of the bubble as well. The first force is the imbalance between the rights of the tenant and the rights of the landlord. The second one, and that's what we would call security of tenure, the second one really is the issue of the planning and the interaction between the planning in Ireland and the value of land and the value of property itself. What happened here is that the planning was very much ad hoc. It was delegated directly to the individual local authorities. There was very little oversight as to how they carried it out. So as the result of that, you have contradictory forces acting in different local authorities on their decision to allow permission to build or not allow permission.
So what you're saying, in actual fact, is a double-edged sword. It could be this a measure to control rents, shall we say. But if this, we're talking about if they had introduced rent control during the Celtic Tiger, but now when businesses are closing down because of two particular items which are too high still, rents and insurance, and all the services, because in Ireland nothing has been controlled. As far as I've been here in Ireland, I've seen that nothing, there's been no control whatsoever. During the Celtic Tiger, the inflation was rampant, okay? The cost of living was rampant, and that caused, as you know, pressure on salary increases, which were obtained 2-3 times after the social pact had ceased as expired, with the result that now, in fact, without any rent control, these businesses are closing, and the government are reluctant to introduce that. What is their take? I mean, why is this? Why can they not introduce that? Because that could solve a bit the problem.
Well, let's go back to the beginning where you started from. In terms of the rents, the problem right now with the rents is not so much the rent control, but the fact that most of the contracts which were signed during the Celtic Tiger, traditional to Ireland types of contracts, where it's only upward rent reviews allowed.
Which
so
is
in other words, it's completely mad, yes. So you distort the market. In fact, actually, if you want, it's too much of a control in the wrong direction.
Of course.
You know, so if you want to allow the market for rents, for example, right now, to function properly, and we know that it does function in the new leases being signed. So, for example, if the business were to shut down right now, go into the bankruptcy, shut down, and literally reopen next day as a new business, it can obtain exactly the same premises at a much cheaper rate. This is, it's completely mad a scenario, and the government is very reluctant to do anything about that for a very simple reason. The government currently is the largest shareholder in the banks and also in NAMA. So the government of Ireland is in effect a very large holder of interest in the commercial property market. If they were to allow review of rents upward as well as downward, so in other words, if they were to allow rents to fall for the existing businesses to the level at which they are for the new businesses, their asset base in the banking sector and also in NAMA will be destroyed. They would have to take write-downs, and that would require even more money injections. It will require more support for the banks. The asset that the government pretends is the positive, net positive asset, such as NAMA, is going to go immediately into deficit and will never come out of it. Now, of course, the reality will take hold sooner or later. This is just a measure of deny and evade. It's not going to hold. The market is going to force the true valuation of rents sooner or later.
The market will settle things.
Exactly. But the problem there is that if you don't allow the market settle it up front, if you restrict the market from doing so, as we do now with the upward-only rent reviews, you are generating another effect, kind of a bubble effect. The expectations are going to continue acting against the existing law. So as a result of it, the destruction of jobs, the destruction of businesses, the destruction of value, destruction of VAT revenue for the government as well, income tax revenue for the government as well, will continue, and it will deepen. It will become bigger, bigger, bigger and bigger.
Okay. The other aspect of this debacle is that the government's coffers are very poor. They have committed themselves to guarantee the banks, to bail out the banks, if you like. And they don't have enough money to run the country, so to speak, because of the loans that they have contracted with the ECB and the IMF. Now, I always thought, and some other observers think, that one pot where the money which was created really for the government went was the public sector. The public sector is a colossal pot, you know, where the salaries are too high. And are the government doing something proper about this, because they have introduced levies, they've introduced taxes, but it seems to me that they're hitting more the low-income categories rather than starting from the top. Now, starting from the top, I've always argued, could mean, for example, reducing drastically the number of political representatives between TDs and senators, because here, as you may have calculated, there is one representative per 18,000 inhabitants, whereas in Italy, the so-called scandalous Italy and vituperated Italy, corrupt Italy, at least we do something right. We have one representative per 62,000 inhabitants, not 18,000. So they could, in Ireland, in my opinion, they could function with 100 rather than 220.
I completely agree with you. Again, if we start from where you started the question and you started your suggestion, first of all, if you look at the structure of the deficit in Ireland right now and the structure of the debt, throughout the crisis, the banks, if you take the committed amounts that have been committed to them but yet haven't been paid, and the amounts which were paid out, that amount of that exchequer in Ireland, or the government of Ireland, assumed as a part of the deficit and ultimately debt, government debt, is pretty much the same as the amount of the deficit that was generated by just paying the wages, salaries, social welfare rates, health expenditures in a public sector. So in other words, the Irish public sector, the Irish fiscal crisis, is separately of equal magnitude as the banking crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really what makes Ireland unprecedented, because if you look at, for example, Portugal, in the case of Portugal, the problem is the fiscal crisis. In the case of Greece, the problem is the fiscal crisis. In the case of, say, for example, Spain, it is more of a banking crisis, less so much of the fiscal crisis. In the case of Ireland, it's both at the same time. Iceland didn't have fiscal crisis. It had the banking crisis. This is why we're in a very hard situation. You can't really, there is no precedent of getting out of this simultaneously, this situation. Japan, for example, when it started its balance sheet recession in the early 1990s, like 89, around there when it started, had a fairly benign government debt.
Mm-hmm.
It had very high private savings. It only started accumulating tremendous amounts of debt on the government side when they realized that the 1990s process of rescue wasn't working, and in the late 1990s, beginning of the noughties, beginning of the current decade, or the last decade now already, they started more aggressively writing down liabilities on the bank side using the taxpayer money. They spent about 1 trillion in just direct injections of, to write off the bad assets on the zombie banks. And they spent about 20% of their GDP right there. So in that sense, Japan acquired a similar problem to Ireland, but on a smaller magnitude, in the process of restoring the banking and the economic health. But Ireland acquired it from the beginning of the crisis, and this is really, really problematic for us. Now, the solution that you present, or the idea that you present, is, to me, is completely correct. Any sort of adjustment has to be led by first taking that adjustment at the top.
Right.
And it is beyond any doubts that when we talk about the top, we're not talking about the so-called fat cats in the private sector. We're talking about fat cats in the public sector.
That's right.
If you look what has happened in the last 4 budgets, including the emergency budget as well, the amount of taxation measures which have fallen onto the shoulders, proportionally relative to income, on the shoulders of the upper middle class and middle class,
Yes.
exceeds the amount of the taxation measures which have been applied to the lower classes, which is fine. That's how it should be in the first place, because of course, even though proportionally it might be the same amount, it's much more painful to take, say, 20 euro out of the balance, a balance sheet of the household which is very poor, than say 200 euro out of the balance sheet of the household which is wealthier and better off. That might be the case, that's fine, but what clearly has happened there is that at the top of the distribution in the public sector of the wages, the cuts have been much less than at the lower parts of the distribution in the public sector wages. It's not to say that the adjustment shouldn't be taking place across the entire public sector. It has to be. We have to reduce the numbers employed in the public sector, both at the top, at managerial grades, closer to the top, and also at the bottom. We also have to reduce the wages. Not so much the wages I don't like the idea of saying we reduce the wages, because it sounds like what you do is you just shave everyone off, say 10%. No, that's the wrong approach to me. We need a reform which will tie the productivity of the individual to what they receive. So there might be a teacher who deserves an 80,000 euro a year, and next to him or her there might be another teacher who is only deserving 20,000 a year. That has to be restored, okay, that relationship. But how you go about it is a very difficult concept and a very difficult task, so let's not get into that right now. But if we go back to the issue of cut at the top, yes, you have to start cutting at the top, and only then afterwards you percolate cutting into the lower ranks as well. You also don't just simply go and cut, you need reforms, and you need to bring people along with you on those reforms. In the public sector right now, there are a lot of people who would be incensed by what is going on there, in terms of the lack of productivity, the work practices and all of that. But at the same time, what you need to do then is you need to identify them, empower them, bring them along with you in the process of reform. We've been for 3 years into this crisis already, 3.5 years into this crisis, and nothing has changed. There is no structural reform.
No, well, I mean, of course, a rampant bonus culture as well, and all this stuff.
That goes even including to the banks. I mean, that is where the public sector and the private sector, if you think about it, traditionally we divide economy into public sector and the private sector. In Ireland it's slightly different. There are really 3, broadly speaking, sectors. There is the public sector, there is a private sector which leaves, domestic internal private sector, which leaves off the public sector. Exists on the back of the government expenditure, in effect, okay, to a large extent. And then there is exporting sector. Now, if you look what you want the economy to look like, is you would want the entire economy to look like that exporting sector. Because whether it's indigenous exporters, which is a small fringe, but still, fairly active fringe, or it is the multinationals, they are highly effective, highly efficient, highly productive.
A final question of a philosophical nature. After watching what has happened to Ireland, where not uniquely, of course, the excesses of the so-called capitalistic model have been mighty, don't you think that, in fact, the Western capitalistic model is in decline because it's not working? It lends itself to excesses because again and again, as I've done in many other discussions with other academics, we should remember what a great German philosopher said, Immanuel Kant, that democracy, I mean that fairness in economics as well, in economic life, is the summation of the limitation of individual liberties for the common good. But this is utopia, that's what doesn't exist.
This is why I don't like the idea of dividing everything into the kind of Western capitalism, some other form of capitalism. All of the isms are slightly artificial. Okay, if you look at what has happened, let's start with the high level. Let's look at the Western democratic societies. Since the World War II, there was a very clear trend, and this is true not just in Europe, perhaps Europe would be more pronounced, but also in other countries, towards what we call a social democratic model of economy, whereby the democracy acts to, if you want, democracy acts both as the feedback from people into the economic decision making, but also as the constraint from people. And that constraint, unfortunately, in most of the Western societies has led to the unsustainable, if you want, acceleration or increases in public debt. That process somewhere stopped around 1998, end of the 1990s. Most pronounced probably that would be the period of the presidency of Bill Clinton in the United States. The public debt, ramp up in order to finance social democratic expenditures, in order to effectively subsidize the older generation against the balance sheet of the younger and the future generations as well. That process kind of flattened out. We accumulated very high levels of debt, and the balance started to shift towards pushing more debt away from public expenditure into private sector. And that's really the story of the bubble of the noughties, of the decade from about 2000 onwards, where the substitution was increasingly shifted the debt burden for finance and public investment in particular through the private-public partnerships, for example, and other mechanisms of taxation and joint development between the public sector and the private sector. It shifted the large amounts of that debt onto the shoulders of the private sector. This happened in my view, that happened because most of the economists naively, continuously, and still do so, treated the debt in the economy as three different silos. As effectively there is an isolated silo of debt in the public sector, there is isolated silo of debt on the household side, and there is an isolated silo of debt on the corporate side and banking, or whichever way you want to. Okay. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't matter which silo is overflowing. It is the ordinary income earners in the end, as taxpayers or as employees, who are going to pay for it, or shareholders. The economy is singular. You can't pile on too much private debt and say, oh, everything is okay because we have very little public debt. And vice versa, you can't pile on too much public debt and say everything is okay because we have low private debt. What happened in Ireland is that Ireland is a kind of a microcosm, like almost a petri dish, where you can see that process really well represented and where the extreme is on both sides. The public sector debt was very low during the late 1990s and the noughties, and in fact actually it bottomed out in 2006 at about 25% of GDP. But let's not forget, first of all, there was only 1 year in the entire history of Ireland when the Irish government has actually paid down some amount of debt. It never paid down the debt, it was just deflated by growth. Okay. The second thing what happened is that the government has never really moderated its expenditure. Instead, what it was using windfall taxes from the transactions in the property market in order to finance ever increasing expenditure. What happened during the noughties? The Irish government was ramping up expenditure at double almost the rate of the growth in the economy. That's its own government expenditure. It was all looked sustainable because they were using the windfall tax revenue for it. Okay. At the same time, the same government was reducing the amount of services and responsibilities that it held in order to provide those, in order to raise that finance. So in other words, it was increasing finance inflow, and at the same time it was decreasing the amount of what it used it for.
The actual, yes.
So the model which evolved from the middle 1990s till today is the model of the social partnership, which is actually very familiar to the Italians because it is the old Mussolini's model. It's a corporatism. That's exactly what it is. And Ireland is not unique in that sense. If you look at the EU, as the whole institution of the EU, if you go to Brussels documents, you look at the latest, for example, economic policy platforms such as Europe 2020, this is a corporatist document. It talks about the social partnerships. It talks about bringing in corporate interests together with the social interests into the room and dividing the economic pie. It talks about the only measures in terms of developing the economy that it talks about are subsidies, investment subsidies. So it is exactly that model, once again, which has failed completely. Yes, it's unsustainable. We can't keep borrowing against the future generations in order to spend onto ourselves right now.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much for your questions. Delighted.
Thank you.